Hello and welcome to Automating Excel with Python. In today's tutorial, I will teach you about reading spreadsheets with OpenPyXL, sometimes known as OpenPixel. Let's get started. This is what you will learn in this tutorial. I'm going to teach you how to open a spreadsheet, read specific cells, and then we're just going to learn different ways to read parts of the Excel spreadsheet, like a specific row, a specific column, cells from multiple rows or columns, cells in a range, and then of course all the cells in your entire spreadsheet. Let's take a step back and talk about some common terminology that you'll find when you're working with spreadsheets. One is of course the word spreadsheet or workbook. When I refer to either of these items, it is referring to the file itself, the XLS file or XLSX file. These are the common versions of Microsoft Excel. The one with the X on the end is the latest version of Excel, whereas XLS is more like Windows 2000 era, but is still somewhat popular, so I mention it here. Either way, OpenPixel has no problem working with either of these formats. When I mention a worksheet or simply sheet, I'm talking about a single sheet of content within a workbook. Spreadsheets can contain multiple worksheets. A column is, of course, a row of columns along the top. They usually are labeled with letters. In Excel, they're always labeled with letters, starting with the letter A and going through Z. And if you need more than 26 columns, Excel totally supports this, and it'll just start doubling the letters. So it'll be something like AA, AB, AC, etc. And you can just kind of see what it does. There is basically an infinite number of rows, starting with the number 1. You'll note that Excel does not do zero-based rows like you might be familiar with in Python. Things are zero indexed in lists and tuples, for example, but in Excel terminology, everything starts with 1. A cell is a combination of a column and row, like A1. So, there are a couple of fundamental actions that you'll be doing with Microsoft Excel documents. One of the most basic is reading data from the Excel file. The rest of this tutorial will show you different ways to get data from your Excel spreadsheet. To get started, we're going to open a workbook in the next section. So, of course, if you want to open a spreadsheet, you need to actually have one to take a look at. So I'm going to show you, I'll jump over here. I'm going to show you the worksheet we'll be working with. So let's open this up. And I will show you the data that I created. It's a little bit hard to read, so let's zoom in. Okay, so we have columns A, B, C, and D that have data in them. And then we have 4 rows of data. Python 1, 01, DevX Python recipes, and Python interviews. The other thing I want to mention is that we have 2 worksheets. So along the bottom, you can see there are 2 tabs. We have sheet 1 and sheet 2. The reason it opens on sheet 2 is that when I saved the Excel spreadsheet, I happened to have this sheet open, and so it saved it on the last sheet that I had open. Now, if I went to sheet 1, books, and saved my file here, the next time I opened it, it would jump back to this one. All right, so you notice I have different data in different worksheets. This becomes important because we're going to learn how to access the data across the entire spreadsheet, but also in each sheet individually. So let's start learning. We're going to look at my example spreadsheet. Let's open it up using OpenPyXL. So you have OpenPyXL installed, so you can import different items from the OpenPixel or OpenPyXL package. Typically, you'll want to use the load workbook function. So we're going to do from OpenPixel, import load workbook, and then we will load the workbook. To do so, you pass in a file that you want to load. Now, of course, if the file does not exist, you're going to get an error here. So just make sure that you pass it a valid path. And probably a good idea to pass a fully qualified path. What that means is, if you're in Windows and you saved it in your Documents folder, you need to specify, it's on your C drive, users, my documents, or whatever that path is to your Excel spreadsheet. In this case, I'm kind of cheating a little bit because I saved books.xlsx in the same folder that my open workbook.py file is in, and so I can just open it that way as well. So anyway, we load the workbook. It returns our workbook object, and from that we can extract the sheet names. So we should see when we run this code, it should print out sheet 1 books and sales when this line of code is reached. And then we're going to grab the active worksheet. Now the active worksheet should be the one that it is currently on, which will be sales, because that's what it opened up on last time. So hopefully it'll print out sales when we print the sheet out. And I think right here it's going to actually print out the sheet object name, whereas sheet.title will actually have the sheet as its name. Anyway, let's see what happens when you run this code. So let's see, we're going to run that, and it should print out something here in a second. Okay, worksheet names, sheet 1 books and sales. Okay, that looks right. You can see this is an object because it's in these little carets, kind of like parentheses, or kind of like pokey parentheses, I like to call them. It says that we're in the worksheet sales, and then of course we grab the title, which is sales, which matches up with what we expected it to give us. So now you know how to load a workbook into OpenPixel so you can start using it in Python, and you can grab the active worksheet as well as the title. Now, of course, that isn't extremely helpful, but it gets you your foot in the door in understanding how to work with Excel with Python. So let's select a specific worksheet. Right now, we're just grabbing whatever the active worksheet is that is saved in the file. But let's say we want to switch and grab a different one, like the sales one that we have here. Let's say that we want to grab this one specifically. We don't know that it's going to be the one that is selected, for example. So to specify that, we're going to pass in the path to the file as well as the sheet name. We'll do much of the same code that we did before by loading the workbook. But this time we're going to check and say, if the sheet name is in workbook.sheetnames, try to open it. We could add an else statement here that would throw an error and say, hey, this sheet name is not in this workbook. We're just going to close and end here. And you probably should do that in your real code. Anyway, we're going to assume that the sheet name is in there, and it's going to return the sheet. So to do that, you do workbook, and you use kind of a dictionary syntax using square braces to pass in the sheet name, and it will return that specific worksheet. And then you can run it and get the title and a little bit of extra information which we haven't seen before. So here we're calling calculate dimensions. Now, calculate dimensions will return the data that we want to know about that is in the worksheet. So we know A1 to D4 has data in it. We can go back in here and say A1, which is right here, to D4, which is over here, all have data in it. And that's what calculate dimensions does. It returns the range, the Excel range that has data in it. So that's super nice. Let's see what happens if we change the code to sheet 1-books. So let's just do that. Sheet 1-books, and we run the code. And here you can see the title is still there because that's what we want. And the cells that contain data are A1 through G23. So if we jump back over here, we can see A1 has data. It contains this books header. And it says there's data all the way down to here. Now, obviously there isn't data there, but Excel thinks that we have done some work in there. And I think I did on accident when I created this. I think I selected the data, and when I was typing, it added all these extra cells that I don't really need. Technically, the data that it actually contains should be at E5, but you can see that Excel has already put a border around all the other cells, even though they're empty, and it likes to say that they have data too. So watch out for that, because this can be a little bit misleading and cause some little troubleshooting hiccups if you're not aware of how OpenPixel and Excel itself defines data. All right, let's continue and learn how to read from a specific cell. So reading specific cells in OpenPixel is pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at this. So here we do the same stuff that you've seen before. We load the workbook, we get the sheet object. We're going to go ahead and print it out to make sure that we're in the right sheet that we expect to be in. And then we're going to print out the title, and then we're going to grab the value that is in A2 and A3. And so this is a pretty easy way to do it. You can just say sheet, and note that we're doing the dictionary syntax again by passing in a string that represents the column and row location of the cell that we want to grab. Now, theoretically, you can also do this and just assign a specific cell value to a variable. So here we have sheet B3, and we set that to the variable cell, and then you can just do cell.value. I can see that as a really good way to do it. We could create a for loop here and basically loop over that range that we got from the previous example and just pull out the data that way too. But this is a nice and easy way to do it. So here we have workbook is sales, A2 is Python 101, A3 is WX Python recipes, and the value of the cell is 5 for B3. Let's go and verify that it's doing what we expect it to do. So here we are in sales. Let's see, I'll move this over here. A2 is Python 101, A3 is WX Python recipes, and the value of B3 is 5. So it did indeed work the way it is supposed to. Let's go ahead and learn how to read cells from a specific row. So here we're going to pass in our path, the sheet name that we want to grab from, and the row that we want to grab from. So here we have the same kind of code. This time I actually added that code I was talking about earlier, where we can say if you pass in a sheet name that does not exist in the worksheet, it's going to print out that that sheet name doesn't exist, and it's going to quit. And so I just return early here. Otherwise, I'm assuming the sheet is there because it didn't cause this error to be written, or this item to be printed. It's not really an error, but it prints it out. Anyway, so now the sheet exists. We're going to grab that specific sheet object, and then we're going to loop for cell in sheet row. Just like I was talking about in the previous example, we can loop over different row cells. So to do this properly, you do cell.columnLetter and then cell.row, and then we do cell.value. And the reason I do this is so that we can print out which column and row section we're on and its value. So let's go ahead and run this code. And you can see here that it goes A2, B2, C2, D2, E2, F2, and G2. Really nice. You note that I switched which sheet we're working on. So I switched back to sheet 1 books. And it's going to go across starting on number 2 and just go across the top. And you'll see that F2 and G2 are both none. That's what happens when there's no data there. Super nice. Let's talk about trying to read cells from a specific column rather than a specific row. The code is pretty much exactly the same. The code, you can see here the real difference is that we're passing in a column value this time, and here we're calling the column. So let's go back. Whoops. Let's go back to the previous example. Here we're doing sheet row, and here, whoops. Here we're doing sheet column. So OpenPyXL does a really good job of knowing what the heck you're trying to do. It can figure out that you're trying to loop over a row or a column, so that when we run this code, we just get the data out of the A column here. So you can see here that we got A1 through, it basically goes off the screen. You can't even see what all it is. There's a bunch of nones because, like I said, I kind of messed up and left too many blanks in here. But that's how you do it. You just pass in the column or the row and let OpenPixel do the rest. Makes it really nice and clean. Let's talk about how we would do reading cells from multiple rows or columns. There are actually two methods to do this that are provided by the OpenPixel package. You can use iter rows or iter columns. When you're iterating over these, you have different method arguments. So min column is an int, has the smallest column index. It's a 1-based index. Note that we're not dealing with the 0-based index that we normally do in Python, because Excel itself doesn't really allow that. So everything's 1-based to kind of match up with the way Excel thinks of things. So we have min row, min column, max row, and then of course value is only. Whether or not we only want the cell value that should be returned. That's a quick and dirty way to grab just the values rather than trying to get the row and column information as well. So let's look at how we could do this. We're going to iterate over cells and rows. This time we're just going to pass in the path and the sheet name and not worry about passing in which rows and columns we want, because we're going to loop over a bunch of them. And then we're going to jump down here where the meat of the code is. For value in sheet.iter rows, we're going to tell it we want to start in row 1 and go to the maximum row of number 3. Minimum column is 1, maximum column is 3. And we're just going to grab the values only and print the value. So let's run that, and you can see that's the value that is returned when you loop over this code. Let's make this a little bit more readable. Let's pop that in like that. And I think we can even fit that on there. There we go. So you can see that this whole thing is just one little function call. So when you run it, it's going to print out what is in each of those rows. So let's go over here and see what we're talking about. So we're on sheet 1 books, row 1 is books, and you'll see that what it's doing is that A1 has books in it, and B and C are technically blank. In Excel, when you merge cells, the cell that actually contains the value is the leftmost cell that is in the merged cell group. So even though I have cells merged from A through G, A is the only one that holds the value. And the Excel does some calculating underneath the covers to center it across the columns that I had selected when I did that. So from Excel's point of view, A is the only one that has data, and B through G are empty or none. So that's why you end up with books, none, none. Next, we end up with title, author, publisher, and Python 101, Mike Driscoll, Mouse versus Python for the third one. And you can see quite quickly that it's going from rows 1 through 3 and columns 1 through 3. So 1, 2, 3 is A, B, C, and of course 1, 2, 3 from the top. Pretty easy to do. You can also use iter columns here. So if we wanted to swap this out, we could use iter columns, and it would loop from the columns perspective. So instead of looping over the rows top to bottom, it would loop across the columns left to right. But you could probably leave the rest of the arguments the same and get the same result. It really depends on which way you want to iterate over your Excel spreadsheet. All right, let's talk about reading cells from a range. So you can actually specify a cell range with OpenPixel. To do that is you do the same thing that you do in Excel. You say you want to go A1 to B6, for example, and you pass that in. So we're going to pass in our cell range. We're going to grab the cell range by passing it to the sheet object. It knows how to accept that. And then we can say for cell and column. If the instance is a merged cell, we're going to skip it. And the reason I'm skipping those is because I've found that OpenPixel will sometimes throw kind of some screwy errors, or you'll just get weird data if you're messing with a merged cell. And, this is my way to work around it. You're welcome to come up with another way to work around it. But I just like to skip the merged cells because, the first cell has data and the rest do not, and it can be kind of confusing to try to figure out what is going on there. So I'm just going to skip cells that are of the type merged cell. And then the rest, I'm just going to print out the value. So let's give this a go. If we run this, you can see that it prints out all the data. Now, some of the data is truncated because my my screen doesn't have a big enough resolution to show everything. But you can see that it works the way we would expect it to work, and it will print out all the values from A1 through B6 accordingly. Give it a try. Try putting in some different values. I mean, we could just say we don't want to go to B6. We want to go to B3 and rerun this, and you can see that now it's not truncated in my Jupyter Notebook like it was before. So, just play around with that, and you can see what will happen. So now we finally get to the last bit where we want to read all of the cells in all of the sheets. Before, we were only working on extracting data from a single sheet in the workbook. This time we want to grab all of the data from all of the worksheets. To do that is actually pretty straightforward and doesn't really take any more code than it did before. This time I'm still going to skip merge cells like I did before. But otherwise, we're just going to read all the data. So this time I'm just passing in a path. We open up the workbook. And we loop over each sheet name that is in the workbook. For each sheet name, we extract the sheet object. We're going to go ahead and print out the title so we know which sheet we're on while we're getting data from it. And then for each row in the rows of data and each cell in each row, we're going to print out whatever's in there. Now, if you run this, obviously it's going to go way off the screen. In fact, Jupyter Notebook is actually nice enough to me. It's going to add me a way to scroll through it all. So you can see that it starts with Sheet 1 Books, which we can see here is the first worksheet. And we can go through and it prints out all the data as we would expect it to do. And if you scroll all the way past all these nones, eventually you'll get down, hopefully, to the next worksheet. Title is Sales. So now we can switch and we can see that it is printing out all of our sales data here. It looks like it does run out. It doesn't let me scroll all the way to the bottom. But you can see that it does work. So this is a quick way to read all of the data in your entire spreadsheet. And since you're reading it just a column at a time, you're probably not going to run out of memory on your machine, unless, of course, you're dealing with a worksheet that is just ginormous. Anyway, let's talk about refactoring the code just a little bit here, because OpenPixel just gives you some other ways to do things, and I just like to show ways to make your code better. So if we want to read all the data values, we could do this. We can simplify it completely and just use iter rows instead and just print out the value. See how we pass in only values that are equal or true. And this time we don't pass in the min and max columns or rows like we did earlier. So if we run this, it's going to loop over each of the rows, and you'll see that we have the title and then a tuple that contains all the data in our spreadsheet. This is a quick way to do it. Nothing wrong with that. If you change this to columns, I think the data is slightly different. Yeah, if you change it to columns, it's going to read it a little bit differently, and you'll get the data out differently because you're reading the entire columns instead of the rows, which may make it harder to parse and understand. I prefer the rows version. I think it's just easier to match up with your spreadsheet than the columns version is. But, if your mind is different, then you might find the other one easier. Anyway, that reaches the end of our tutorial. To wrap up, I want to remind you that in this tutorial, you have learned about opening a spreadsheet, reading from specific cells, specific rows or columns, reading multiple rows or columns, as well as a range, and of course, finally, what we just did, which was reading cells from all of the sheets. I hope you found this helpful, and I look forward to talking to you in the next lesson.